All right, what's cracking, guys? So today I'm sitting down with Wil Starks, and we're going to be talking all about weight management and water cuts for competition. Now, this is something that I get questions on, semi-frequently, and I have my own opinions on this, but this definitely isn't something that I really specialize in because I usually tend to recommend athletes not cut a whole lot of weight. Now, that's neither right or wrong. That's just my personal preference. So I wanted to bring someone in who has a lot more experience in this and is very, very knowledgeable, and was actually recommended to me by Dr. Mike Israel, who's been on the podcast before. So, Wil, thanks so much for jumping on, man. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me on. Looking forward to hopefully elaborating on some valuable details regarding water weight cutting for sports, why they can be helpful, and then some possible risks or some definite risks, but then some possible strategies to minimize or decrease the likelihood that you as an athlete or a coach wind up in a really bad position prior to competition.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people really, really talk about. Like, people say, like, oh, yeah, I'm doing a water cut or I'm doing this, but I don't think they really understand some of the intricacies involved with properly dieting down and properly doing some of these strategies to perform really well in a meet. So, can you give a little bit of a background for yourself and kind of how you got, I guess, around with RP, just for listeners who maybe aren't familiar with who you are?
I say my name is Wil Starks. I am 28 years old, and my sports science and martial started after high school. I grew up fascinated with MMA. I was a big fan of Georges St. Pierre growing up. Kind of shared a similar story with being bullied and wanting to become stronger. But the thing that drew me most to him was his scientific approach to the sport. He looked the part, and that I think that was a byproduct of how he prepared for competition. He was doing strength and conditioning. He was eating healthy, relatively healthy year round, and he took a very tactical approach to MMA in preparation for each of his individual opponents. So I actually my first run in with the principles of water weight cutting were during senior year. Actually, I had this teacher, Dr. Reed, who gave us an assignment to do a presentation on something we found interesting. And I found an old article actually by Dr. John Berardi with Precision Nutrition. Just kind of, I'm not sure who the guy was that was writing it, but he basically highlighted his water weight cutting experience. And when I looked at it, it made complete sense to me. And again, I was enthralled by the process and was going on and on about all the variables you manipulate to make sure you could be on weight for the day of weigh-ins and then reconstitute and show up heavier and prime for competition. So that kind of steered me in the direction of studying exercise physiology going into university. An experience I initially bombed, but that's also where I ended up meeting Dr. Mike Israel. So I walked on to the wrestling team at University of Central Missouri in Warrensburg, Missouri, after only 1 year of wrestling, actually, in high school. And there I met Jared Feather, one of our RP's, my head bodybuilding and contest prep coaches. So we became friends, and he was really, at the time, he was really involved in the campus exercise physiology community. And so he actually helped catch me up to speed on a lot of training strategy that wasn't even, at the time, it wasn't even aware it existed. So then when I ended up moving back home for a period of time around 2013, 2014, and I kind of refocused on yes, or I focused and dialed in on MMA training. Dr. Mike Israel actually started teaching at UCM. So that's where my first experience of running with him was. Jared was bragging about this new, really smart Russian Jewish guy who was jacked, super strong, and was in the weight room shouting and whatnot. And he told me I had to come up and meet him and just talk to him. So I met Mike in 2014 at UCM through Jared, and uh, we kind of clicked initially. He was one of the first professors or people in general that really had enough depth of knowledge with sports science that he could break it down. He could break it down to their individual principles or components, so that not only could I understand it, but I found I found the desire to delve deeper, right? And kind of experiment and take those principles and create my own practices. So he really inspired, a lot of my desire to pursue higher education, just beyond, getting a bachelor's or, getting a personal training certification and then settling on, like working at your local YMCA. So then fast forward from 2014 and on, I continued training MMA. And in 2015, I actually made the amateur national team. So this is through the United States Mixed Martial Arts Federation. And after winning nationals, I qualified for the International Mixed Martial Arts Federation World Tournament, and that was held in Vegas. And so the IMMAF, so the acronym or the abbreviation for that is they started sanctioning MMA around the world in countries that weren't really exposed to MMA at the time. And they're trying to give the amateur MMA scene a look that was easily distinguishable from the professional scene. They wanted a professional look still, but they wanted it to look safe and appealing so that eventually it could be pushed or moved into the Olympic Games. And I think that's still a goal they're pursuing right now. So I won Worlds in 2015, and then I actually went for a second run in 2016 and was successful as well before turning pro the following year. And then, we get into a long spiral up and then straight down to rock bottom, before landing, back here on this podcast. But that is the longer, or say like the longer drawn out version of how I met Mike and got involved with RP. Around 2019, I started interning for him. We got reconnected, and he offered the opportunity, and I launched some more online coaching. And that's also when I was getting more heavily involved in competing again for myself and setting some professional goals for the medium and long term. And now here I am, currently the director of sport performance at a local gym here in my hometown. I'm training for the facility as well, and then I'm a licensed massage therapist, and still continuing with academia as well, pushing for cognition and neuroscience in the long term.
That's awesome, man. So to dive right into it, I guess just to sort of like set the stage, can you just sort of broadly describe some of the various strategies that are utilized and implemented in weight cutting? So everything from different dieting strategies to the water cut to saunas or whatever else is used, just so people kind of have like a reference.
Yeah, I think most, unfortunately, most people, so when they hear weight cutting, they just think, they think extreme dieting, but I don't think they think about it within the context of sport, like sport only, right? Like you talk to the general or a layman, individual, and they're just thinking, okay, you're gonna crash diet. In essence, this is the same thing I do when I'm, doing some sort of 90-day challenge to lose a bunch of weight. But there are three areas that are primarily focused on manipulating with a water weight cut. So you're gonna go through. One of the strategies involves diet, right? So you're adjusting carbohydrates and sodium. So with those with carbohydrates, for every gram of carbohydrate you ingest, you're going to retain roughly 3 to 4 grams of fluid with that. And then with sodium, for every roughly, let's say 400. This is more anecdotal. I'm loosely referencing some of Dr. Derek Wilcox's presentation points on this, but around 400 milligrams of sodium, will retain upward of around two pounds of body weight. And so that's give or take. It's obviously athlete size dependent, and their activity, depending on how much they sweat and how how conditioned they are. But then you have the hormone factor as well. So with hormones, sodium included, sodium and electrolytes included in this, you'll have the water portion as well. So for the first 3 days, you are water loading, right? So you're trying to push your body in the flushing direction, right? So you want to get, if it, like you have like aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, are the chief hormones that are involved in water retention and sodium retention. And so once you begin the loading process and you accompany sodium with that as well, your body goes into a flushing mode where you're excreting water. There's an initial weight gain period. And then as you get closer to the fight, instead of, and a mild caveat here, most people, including myself in the past, make the mistake of like trying to taper off your water intake. And it's actually a mistake just because hormones end up shifting relatively quickly following changes in fluid and electrolyte intake. So tapering off your water intake doesn't set you up for excreting the amount of fluids that would be ideal for making the weight cut in the last 24 hours. So you'll load up on water, and sodium for the first 3 days or so, and then during the last 1 or 2 days and 24 hours, you'll pretty much abruptly cut them off, right? So then you're still in an excreting, you're still in a flushing mode, and then you can finish up with sauna or sweatsuit sessions, and like I said, any type of supplements that you would supplements that you'd be using to help with flushing water at that point. But that's not necessarily something I would recommend. I prefer when I'm working with athletes or even with myself to make sure that training is set up in a way where we can deplete glycogen early enough, paired with the decrease in carbohydrates and the flushing, that we don't necessarily have to rely on supplement use, like that we don't have to rely on diuretic use that later on, because there are some posed with that. Or the reconstitution part. So after you make weight, ideally you're not dehydrated long. Like I said, the last portion is within the last portion is during the 24-hour period, and that way you're not dehydrated excessively long, and then you end up recarbing back up, rehydrating, and with that component, you end up you're looking for like moderate protein, high carbohydrate, and low fat meals early on, and then you also following that, you end up returning back to a roughly normal eating schedule, where you're still focused on capping off the carbohydrates lost during the glycogen repleting process, and then basically finishing up with whatever smaller details necessary prior to stepping into the cage.
Mm-hmm. And so as far as like, obviously it's a little bit different in MMA and boxing and things like that, but in powerlifting, you have sometimes like a 2-hour weigh-in or a 24-hour weigh-in. So obviously there's going to be different strategies depending on which one you're using, because you don't necessarily have the same window post weigh-in to, refuel, rehydrate, all that stuff. So when you are thinking about improving your glycogen stores, recarbing up, when you're thinking about improving your hydration status, what are some of the things that you really need to think about? Because a lot of the times people will focus a lot on water, which obviously is very important, but there's so many other aspects to hydration status and balance than just water. So can you kind of touch on that?
Yeah. So I said with the first component, when you're looking to start when you want to excrete water, depleting glycogen is going to be crucial, right? So dropping carbs during that initial, so weigh-ins typically have the water weight cut process is typically like a 5 to 6 day process. So when you drop carbohydrates, that makes you less prone to holding on to water. There is potential for using potassium as well, since it seems to be potassium being a sodium antagonist, and helping to expel water. In that case, there's some potential there, although I don't even have any like literature citations for that, because I know manipulating sodium and electrolytes, or sodium potassium rather, are potentially dangerous. And so I don't know if there are any individuals or researchers that are willing or able to put themselves or study subjects, in harm's way to see what the potential for water weight cutting for sport are in that manner. But there is potential there with potassium. But one of the biggest things I found to help during the week of the weight cut, outside of water, carbohydrates, and electrolyte manipulation, is also your training strategies. And so, obviously, during the water weight cut, you're still going to be training as you peak for competition. There's so like the final peaking block of a training phase, instead of a traditional accumulation deload paradigm where maybe we start low and then climb high before deloading at the very end. We'll start roughly higher and then taper down lower, just to make sure that preparedness shoots through the roof as fatigue drops even more than it would in a traditional sense. And so during that week, though, you can capitalize on some carb depletion style workouts where so you don't want to tax your athletes tremendously, but we'll go into we call it like alactic aerobic style workouts. And so the final week of training for combat athletes, you're not going to be sparring tremendously hard. You're not going to be putting your athletes at risk of twisting or tearing ligaments, or bruising themselves more than necessary because they already know how to fight. And so what you can do is still have them go through their typical dynamic warm up. You can have them go through drills and situationals, and that's actually the week where I would add in some like fun sport specific style conditioning within certain time constraints, so that you end up working on conditioning fast twitch motor fibers, and you're still depleting glycogen as well, which helps to support the low carb and the lower carb fluid excretion process, and then but without overly fatiguing the athletes during that final week. So that's something I found really helpful as well.
And so what would that look like for strength athletes? Because this podcast is predominantly listened to by, other coaches or powerlifters, strongmen, people who want to get big and jacked, not necessarily like MMA fighters. So how would that change? Like, I definitely understand kind of the underpinnings of what you're talking about, but do you have any specifics, or not necessarily specific, but maybe some guidelines in terms of, peaking for the event? Because obviously we're going to see a reduction in volume. Intensity is still going to stay relatively high, but kind of be more in the moderate zone. So how might that impact the diet composition, and then how might the diet composition impact training performance if we are somewhat depleted of glycogen and carbohydrates and things like that?
So you're asking, like, what would be the difference in trying to help with excreting water in a strength athlete versus a combat sport athlete, where they're not doing the same?
More from a training standpoint, right? Because I definitely understand what you're saying from like a skill component and doing more of those things to prime the athlete for the fight. But from a powerlifting standpoint or a strength athlete standpoint, what would some of those training variables look like that you're going to augment? Because obviously we wouldn't need to necessarily be fully carved up, because the intensity is moderate, but it's not crazy high. Volume's pretty low. So, I don't suspect that it's going to have a huge impact, but what are some of those things that maybe you would do to, let's say, safeguard against that? Or would you even, is there even really a concern in your opinion?
Like safeguarding against like keeping performance high during the weight cut? Or?
Yes, exactly.
Gotcha.
So maintaining performance and athletic ability.
Yeah, no. So, okay. So I guess if you look at my example of combat sport program design, where, and obviously, so we're running strength and conditioning, and I'm using my hand gestures, but I know we're not going to have video coverage on this one, but you have strength and conditioning running on one end concurrently with sport training on the other end. And so the accumulation deload paradigm is going to work pretty similar. If you have someone running a good sport program as well, they will ramp their athletes training up in the practice room and then taper back down in the same manner that they would ramp things up in the weight room and then taper down as well. But that being said, the principle there is just being, you want to maintain a moderate level of intensity, just like you described with powerlifting training during that week. But slice volume, like slice volume in half by roughly 50% or so. But as far, I mean, as far as protecting, protecting the performance of a power lifter, like during that week, as long as they're focusing on those primary variables of staying within the constraints of their deload volume and intensity, pushing the water load correctly early on, and then cutting water and sodium very late, and then using strategies like the sauna, or different sweatsuits very late, very late in the process, and then reconstituting correctly following the weigh-ins. That's the principle there. I believe runs parallel with a combat athlete that it would a powerlifting athlete.
Right. No, that makes sense. So, as far as weight cutting goes, for a strength athlete, and obviously there's kind of like it's a bit of a spectrum, right? It's not like necessarily, okay, after 10 pounds, you're going to see degradation in performance. But,
Mm-hmm.
for a powerlifter, for a strongman, if they're trying to meet a certain weight class, what are some considerations that you would take into account working with an athlete to determine how much weight would be appropriate to cut before you would suspect that they would start seeing, eroded performance? So obviously it's going to change. So let's say something like, have you done a water cut before? How much weight are you looking to cut? How experienced are you with dieting and adherence and things like that? So what are some of those considerations in addition to, like, I don't know, body weight or some other things that you might look at?
Yeah. So, I mean, you listed off a couple physiological and psychological components that go into successful weight cuts or into botching them. And so going through like an athlete history checklist, on one end, it is like you had stated, have they cut weight in the past? Another component is, where are they in their training prep? And not only like how many weeks out are they from their meet, or in this case, I'm trying to like extrapolate my experience working with combat athletes into powerlifting. But again, the principles are gonna run nearly the same here. But are they over? Like if they're 8 weeks out from their meet, are they overly fat based on where they could be to perform at their, to perform optimally for the meet? What I mean by that is, would they be better off go like if they're shooting for a pretty low weight class, like, hey, coach, I want to come in and, I'm 40 or so pounds overweight, right now, and I'm 8 weeks out, but this is the weight class I want to compete in, but I still want to pull, whatever number I think is great. And you're like, like, your body fat percentage and your lean body mass are not, like, for the duration of time we have leading up to the meet, are not quite optimal for pushing enough fluids out to make weight, versus like or rather, so the amount of time we would need to get you lean enough to get you within the safe zone for a 24-hour weight cut is not ideal for the weight class you're shooting for and the numbers you would like to pull or push, if you're pressing in this case. And so what I would look at there is how can we organize their training on the macro level, so we can make sure they have they have an ideal amount of lean tissue on them already, so that most of their weight cut can be water focused, and they're not at risk of losing lean tissue en route to the, like en route to the water weight cutting process, where they're risking not only, like central nervous system fatigue just from the peaking process and overreaching, but now they're also, risking losing actual lean tissue and strength potential leading up to the meet. So that's something on the, like on the physiological level, is their body composition optimized for the weight class and and the numbers goals that they're shooting for. Then on the psychological end, it's, how many times have they cut weight in the past? What does their current schedule look like? How is their sleep hygiene? And then just looking at, overall diet and other external factors that could affect that could affect their stress levels.
Yes, you mentioned a handful of things there that I think are really important and often really, really undervalued. The first one was body composition, especially because in powerlifting, it's almost like a kind of like a joke, where it's like, oh, we're big, but we're fat, and
Yeah.
it's really to the detriment of their athletic performance, in my opinion, like to beyond a certain point anyways, right? Where, you see athletes and it's like, well, you don't really have any reason for being fat. Like it's not like, oh, I'm a power lifter, so I can't get fit. It's like, dude, look at all the old school powerlifters and strongmen. They all look like bodybuilders. It's
Yeah.
just kind of this new sort of mentality that doesn't prioritize nutrition and some of those more difficult behavioral um, habits that are a little bit more challenging to kind of get for the most part. So that was one big one. And then the second thing you mentioned was stress, and then you mentioned sleep. I'd love to go into those two things a little bit more because I really don't think people understand the impact that stress has as well as sleep. And obviously, they're kind of, there's some overlap there on even just things like water retention, right?
Yeah. Yeah, man. So that's that is something big. So, increases in stress, well, I mean, for most people listening, they're already like they'll associate cortisol, as like the stress hormone, which isn't inherently bad, but in this case, with increases in cortisol from increases in stress, also increasing antidiuretic hormone, that's just going to push more water, uh, or it's going to retain more water and work against you in the long term for the weight cutting process. So that's when you look on the recovery side, like proper, getting adequate sleep, um, priming like your nutrient timing, and also ensuring that you're managing fatigue throughout the training block or your training phases are all three important variables when you look at the relationship between the body, like relationship between the physical body and the mind as it pertains to stress. Um, just following basic strategies, like get 7 to 9 hours of sleep roughly for the most part. Don't jump straight into your training phase with don't jump into week one with MRV style training, or if you are, this is where like the auto regulation component of training comes into play as well, where maybe you start off week one all right, and then week two, because of variables slightly outside of your control, let's say yeah, you're a competitive power lifter, but you're also a husband and a father, and you lose sleep or you get an argument with your partner or significant other. You're running a business, or you're just working, and stress goes high there. And then you're also training at like 5 a.m., because you got to balance everything. And you show up to the weight room and you can tell that you're not in the ideal condition to hit the volume or even maybe the intensity that the spreadsheet calls for, but you're stubborn and you're going to hit it hard anyway because that's just the way that it is. And then on top of that, let's say you're also one of those power lifters that just thinks, hey, I'm going to be big because I'm big, and so you use that as a reason or a crutch to eat excessively unhealthy, and so there's a balance there too. And I think RP does an amazing job at highlighting some of the scientific principles of eating for health and body composition, where obviously there's room, say if you're following the 80-20 rule, there's room to enjoy treats or some of your indulgences, but for the most part, 80% of your food intake should be coming from wholesome, minimally processed sources, and should, like your eating or your diet should be organized and periodized in a fashion to, again, optimize your body composition in a specific direction so that you can peak.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's funny that you mentioned that too about the training because a lot of powerlifters, I think, fall into this trap of, oh, I don't feel like I'm beat to shit. I don't know if my training is hard enough. I think I'm slacking. It's like, you shouldn't feel
Mm-hmm.
broken all the time. Like, yes, you're going to go through periods where it's like, there's always going to be something where it's like, ah, my hamstring is a little messed up or my back is tight or whatever, right? And that's normal. But I generally think that you should feel pretty good, you know, and your sessions shouldn't necessarily completely destroy you, because it's like then you're just beating yourself into the ground and you're clearly not doing a good enough job of fatigue management because you're just overtraining, right? And it's funny actually what you mentioned about the auto regulation component. Like this is a conversation I have all the fucking time with athletes regardless of their experience level. Like I'll have this conversation with like world level athletes and they still sometimes don't appreciate the RIR system, right? Where it's like it's
Yep.
meant for auto regulating, so they'll go and they'll take a single at a 2, and the single at a 2 RIR turns into a 1 rep max. And I'm like, bro, what the fuck are you doing? Like, it's a 2 RIR. And they're like, I know, I was just feeling good. And I'm like, yeah, but now you
I
messed
just
up the
gotta
rest of
know,
your
man.
training. Yeah, exactly, right. Or conversely, if they go in and they're supposed to hit a triple at a 3 or something like that, and they're like, oh well, last week I did this, so this week I'm trying to do more. And it's like, okay, but did you feel like you could do more? And they're like, no. And I'm like, so then why didn't you listen? They're like, well, I wanted to hit my RAR target. And I'm like, what is RAR? And they're like, well, it's
Yeah.
this. And I'm like, exactly. This is not a linear progression. This is not a step progression. It's auto-regulatory. It's supposed to allow you to, listen to the feedback and adjust accordingly. And I think especially if you're doing something like a water cut or a diet or all that stuff, like you're putting yourself into a compromised position intentionally, where your recovery might not be as good as it normally is, and you might not feel as good as you normally would, just because you're intentionally depleting glycogen, you're intentionally making these adjustments to your diet that aren't normal. They're not part of your normal training anyways. And so, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that you might feel a little different, and that your performance, I don't think that your performance would suffer, really. That's not the right word, but you might feel a little off, you know
Yeah.
you might not,
No,
but
for
you
sure. I mean,
might as well, right? So yeah.
that's something, I mean, so I can, I share that for, or I share that same experience with coaching combat sport athletes in the weight room, especially when I'm working with like a younger demographic, even if they aren't cutting weight. Let's just take the water weight cutting out of the equation for a second and talk about the ego driven,
Yeah.
male fitness enthusiasts. Not that there aren't, females like this, but if we're speaking from experience, I can speak from personal experience. So I can say I've been, I've been stubborn and have just wanted to grind it out in the weight room at times, especially during the very beginning of my journey, but grind it out for the sake of letting myself know that I can still do it, which, like in retrospect makes absolutely no sense
Yeah.
physiologically, when you actually, when you think about the grand scheme of program design. And so uh, that's something with regards to peaking, I don't think a lot of athletes understand. And I'd actually be curious to know how you work on communicating with your athletes expectations going into the phase and then during, so that they understand that, hey, like you said before, you don't have to feel like you're beat to piss. Like you're not supposed to. There are going to be some sessions where you finish feeling better than when you started, right? And so for me with combat athletes, and when I'm telling them, hey, rate of force development in the weight room right now is our primary and focus. We want max intent during some of these lifts. It's going to be short and sweet. We're not necessarily, we're not doing smokers so in the MMA community, this is something that's still that I'm still trying to help eradicate. And that's this idea that you have to be doing some sort of smoker or finisher, before, during, and after every single practice. And that when you do strength and conditioning, it's basically the exact same thing, because that's something we actually, Mike and I actually touched on in our MMA myths series for strength and conditioning and diet. And that was this idea that there are some athletes that think when I do weight training, right, I need to be mimicking exactly what I'm going to be doing for sport. And so they end up, so they end up, especially with MMA,
Punching
where
with
it's
dumbbells and
basically,
shit and like,
yeah, it's like,
yeah,
okay, so you're doing basically
yeah,
glycolytic training with grappling and takedowns, and you're getting a pump through the evening. But then prior to that, you're in the weight room, you're basically doing the exact same thing, So I don't think people think energy system dependent, as opposed to like tool. I guess they contextualize it differently than, I'm trying to think exactly how to word it. The context with which they put it in is, I need to do my sport in the weight room versus I need to train what can't be hit, what can't necessarily be hit in the sport room, in the weight room, so that I get the best
yeah.
of both worlds during the peaking process. No, so I didn't want to lose the thought, because you had said something regarding concurrent training. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about that, but it flagged a thought, or it flagged a thought in my head about a question you asked prior, and that was, like things you were asking me, what would you suggest a power lifter or strongman style athlete do to help with maintaining fitness during that week of peaking, when they are depleted, on carbohydrates and whatnot. So this is a conversation I remember having. So Alex Viada was, so he's a coach that I followed for a lot of years, and he's big on making sure that powerlifters, and strength athletes in general, are still finding time to get in their aerobic based training, whether it's out of season, and then obviously finding ways to finagle and train it concurrently. And so with aerobic training, you have the benefit of improving recoverability, not only in between training sessions, but even like during like intra-set recovery as well. And so when you said you train concurrently, what were you highlighting or alluding to there?
Yeah. So when it comes to concurrent training, basically what that means is we're training for multiple qualities simultaneously. That could, in the context of strength athletes, that could be strength and hypertrophy, that could be strength and power, that could be strength and speed, that could be strength and endurance. So there's a lot of different things that we might need to develop. And how we're going to execute that is going to depend on the athlete and what they require. So, for instance, if I have a very large athlete who has a very poor level of fitness, and their work capacity is pretty low, well, I'm probably going to place a little bit more emphasis on their work capacity. So I might get them to get out and just get some steps in. I might set a daily step target. I'm a big fan of steps anyways, just because I think that people, not even just physically, but also psychologically, function better when they're moving and when they're a little bit more active. So I think that 10,000 steps is kind of a bare minimum just to be healthy and generally, well, yeah, just generally healthy. So I like to set that for most of my athletes anyways. Some of my smaller athletes, some of the females that I coach, they love cardio. And so if I tell them not to do cardio, because they don't necessarily need it, they're probably still going to do it anyway. So in that instance, I'll have to pick a more traditional form of cardiovascular training that is less detrimental to their actual training. So that might look like, instead of running, because we have the strong eccentric and impact, I might switch them to rowing or cycling, right? Something like that. Or I might get them to maybe do some other form that's not necessarily going to be as detrimental. Maybe if they play a sport recreational, I might have them just, play that sport just for fun or something like that. Something that's not going to be super, super detrimental to their performance or their recovery. So that's usually what I would try and do in those cases. But generally speaking, when I'm talking about concurrent training, what I really mean is within the actual program itself. So on that day, let's take a squat day, for instance. Let's say someone is squatting and their primary barbell work or squat variation, that's the main focus. That's where we're developing the skill of the squat. Okay, so that's probably going to be under 5 repetitions. It usually is, anyways, in most cases, because that's usually what we need to develop a significant stimulus for strength and have the skill of squatting be close enough to your 1RM for it to actually have a high level of transference or dynamic correspondence. Now, for your back off work, for the assistance work, that might be a little bit higher reps. So I might, have someone do stiff leg deadlifts or good mornings. And that, like, I've had athletes do banded good mornings for like 15 reps. And in some cases, that's had a really, really great carryover to their deadlift and their squat, right? For other athletes, I have to have them doing heavier deadlifts, right? And then we go one step further. So now we're 2 orders of magnitude or 2 standard deviations away from the primary work, right? Because we've got our main work, we've got our assistance work, and now we're going to the accessory exercises. And that's really where a lot of the concurrent type training comes into play as far as from a program design standpoint. So I might have, there's a lot of things you can do there. Like if you're using internally or externally stabilized movements, that can allow you to lift much, much higher volume, because it's going to be less fatiguing if you have something that's externally stabilized, like a leg extension or a leg press. So doing a leg press for higher repetitions, shortening your rest periods to force recovery while simultaneously constraining fatigue, because you're not going to be able to lift as heavy if your recovery is insufficient, right? So that's going to be something that you can utilize to increase your work capacity, is constraining rest periods. Actually, that's one thing. I get all my athletes to time their rest periods. If you don't time your rest periods, a lot of the times people can just waste their time in the gym and spend hours and hours and hours when they do not need to. So that's something I find to be really important. And also it helps improve their work capacity, utilizing circuits or supersets. So for instance, I might have someone doing Bulgarian split squats, mixed with, let's say, a lat pull down or something like that. And then, I don't know, maybe some core work, right? So they might do those back to back to back and then have a short rest period at the end, maybe 90 seconds or something like that. And then they do it again for, let's say, 2 to 3 sets, hypothetically, right? So that is often enough to improve their aerobic capacity to the point where they're going to function very, very well for their primary training. So it doesn't need to be anything super special. It doesn't need to be this crazy circuit. It should still be specific, and it should still have some sort of translation into their actual competition movements. And then simultaneously, I'm also a really big fan of having their accessory work also play a role in injury risk management, right? So for instance, utilizing, let's say, a single leg Romanian deadlift, but loading it contralaterally. Okay, so now we're going to have to develop lumbopelvic stability while we're moving, while we're in a hinge pattern, right? So that can be very, very important for developing stability in the hips, in the squat, as well as in the deadlift. Utilizing a Bulgarian split squat, but maybe, offloading it could be very effective at, again, developing better pelvic stability. But then we can also load the split squat in a different way. We can either choose to load the hips more by changing how we're executing the variation, or we can load the quads more. We can choose to have it supported so that we're just able to bang out a bunch of reps and, potentially generate less fatigue, but really train the muscles, right? Or we can have it, unsupported and contralaterally loaded or ipsilaterally loaded. So, there's a lot of different ways to attack this. It just depends on what characteristics you want to develop. But at the same time, I think that you can really improve your work capacity just by making some small adjustments to the actual training. And the actual training should still be specific to what it is that you're trying to do in your sport. It doesn't need to be super far removed. You don't need to be doing these, like burpees or anything like that just to get your heart rate up. You can still improve your work capacity and have a conditioning component in your actual training and have it still be specific, right? And oftentimes it doesn't need to be a ton either. Like, we don't need to be doing 5 rounds of this stuff. Like, sometimes even just 2 rounds or 3 rounds is more than enough, especially if you're doing it multiple times throughout the week. So I think there's a lot of different ways. These are just a couple of hypothetical examples off the top of my head, but hopefully that makes sense. Does that kind of answer your question?
No, definitely does. Definitely. Yeah. That's, man. So circling back to that, like sweating out your body weight, and I guess refocusing on the water weight cut portion of the podcast. So I had so earlier I was highlighting the importance of cutting water off rather drastically late into the cut, right? So like final 24 hours or so, as opposed to tapering off, just because of the hormonal implications there. So I don't feel like, but before I actually dove into the physiology of water retention, I kind of happened upon this during one of my fights, and so this was in Abu Dhabi earlier this year, and then I have another story from UCM when I was wrestling back in 2011. But I think the better example will be this more recent one, where I was traveling overseas, and there was a time zone difference that I thought I accounted for well enough, but turns out I didn't. And then not only that, there were a bunch of factors during during the 3 flights it took us to get, from Missouri to Dallas, Texas, to London, to Dubai, and then finally the drive through customs, which took hours, into Abu Dhabi, where I was highly stressed. On top of that, nutrition wasn't optimal because I wasn't prepared for being stuck at each international checkpoint as long as I actually was. So food later on in the cut was a lot more sodium infused and sparse. Actually, I wasn't able to eat in exactly the way I would have liked going into the cut. So when I made it to the venue and checked my weight a couple of days out, and you have like benchmarks for where you should be ideally, give or take a couple of pounds, just to make sure you're on track. And I was, because of time zone differences and everything I just highlighted, I was way overweight. I was, upwards like 7 pounds off, 7, maybe I think even like 10. I was supposed to be in the mid 160s, and I was like low 170s or something like that. So I had an initial moment where I kind of freaked out, and I was like, oh my God, okay, what the heck am I going to do? Like I'm this late in. I'm basically exactly where I was during the initial water loading phase. Am I going to have to water load again? And, so there's anxiety associated with that. Like, oh, I'm going to have to drink more fluids to get back into a flushing mode, but I'm going to be heavier, but I don't want to over stress about those details and then make water retention worse as well. But even being as close to the fight that I was, I think I was like two days out. I decided after a long walk with my teammate who listened to me, I run through all the details of the weight cut 3 times, in a 40-minute walk. I finally landed on, okay, we need to increase fluids again, and go through the water weight cut workout protocol, as such, and probably add in an extra sauna session. And I ended up having the best weight cut and reconstitution that I had ever had. Like, I ended up filling out more following the weigh-in that I had in the past. And so that was one of those, and the weight came off a lot easier during the final 12 hours than I thought it would, bearing I had basically jumped back up to nearly 2 or so gallons, whereas I was used to, in the past, when I was making the mistake of tapering, I would have been like half a gallon or maybe 3/4 of a gallon. So I nearly doubled my fluid intake and was still within a decent, poised to successfully make a weight cut. So that's something, that's like a funny story I share. It was a lot more funny being there and seeing me freak out the moment I stepped on the scale. And I was like, oh, maybe the scale's not accurate. I don't know. And my buddy stepped on. He's like, I don't know, man. It looks pretty good to me. And so
Yeah.
it was one of those times, like, through experience and being validated, being validated through textbook, like physiology, that the physiological implications for hormonal upregulation or downregulation with like adjusting some of those variables allow for more fluids deeper into the cut than what I originally believed.
Yeah, it's super cool. Like, that's probably one of my favorite things about coaching, is when you look at some of these like mechanistic underpinnings, and then you do them, and then you're like, oh, it happened exactly like that. That's fucking
Yeah.
crazy, And
Yeah.
like, I know that sounds stupid. You're like, we know this, and we did it, and that happened. But to see it from like textbook panning out in real life scenarios is like it's really freaking cool, you know, like
Yeah.
someone's like, oh, my hip hurts or my that hurts, and you're like, oh, okay, here, I want you to do this exercise, and they do that, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my god, I can squat below parallel and I don't have any pain, and you're like, yeah, you know, and they're
That's
like,
it's like, of course, this.
yeah, and you're just like, I don't know, it's fucking crazy, and you're like, yeah, well, your nervous system's reorganizing itself a little bit, right? And
Mhm.
like just even some of these weird concepts, it's yeah, we're really diverging from the topic, but that's fine. It's super interesting, man. Yeah. So what are some of the, I guess, more common mistakes that people make? And then I guess I would like to know how far out as well you would start a cut. And obviously there's going to be some variability there, but maybe just offer some general guidelines for maybe the most common scenarios that you're confronted with.
So common scenario number one, like off the bat, and we touched on this twice, I think now, is a fighter or strength athlete coming into camp or prep just way too out of shape. Period. Right? They don't have an aerobic base. They don't have a solid, you know, and to making PRs for the next meet or the fight, and so they're not even really set. They're not set up for success going into the water cut. They would just be better off sticking to an off season program for another 8 weeks and then having the conversation about going to a contest prep from there. So I would say that's mistake number one. It's just coming in too much body fat, not a good enough aerobic base, not a good enough strength base, and then for the combat athletes out there, not a good enough skill base at all. Second one would be starting a water weight cut too early or too late, right? So because we kind of highlighted that hormones responsible for water and sodium retention fluctuate rather quickly, right? So that they change, in accordance to your fluid and basically to your food and fluid intake. Starting really early on, and it kind of makes, like two, yeah. I think Derek gave an example of this, but I even remember an athlete back in 2014 I was training with. I was an amateur at the time, and he was a pro, and he was talking about basically dropping into ketosis like 2 weeks out from the fight. And I remember, like, I didn't even know nearly as much as I do now about water weight cutting, but that at the time made no sense to me. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, you're 2 weeks out from a fight. Like, you could still be getting really good training in this week. Like being carb depleted is not going to allow you to get the best out of your training sessions. And moreover, like, I'm not even sure what you're accomplishing here. Like, what do you think you're potentiating, by being this depleted that early on, and
Yeah,
then
I'm really skeptical of some of the research that I've seen on like the carb depletion followed by the overload. So I tend to be very skeptical of this research. Essentially, they've done some studies that have shown a potential positive benefit on early carb depletion followed by a rapid repletion just before the competition. But essentially, when we look at like substrate utilization, especially in the metabolic efficiency to process these different substrates, that takes time. And so personally, I don't necessarily think it confers a major benefit. I would still have to see more research on it to really be convinced. But at this time, anyways, I'm just not really holding my breath for anything like that, especially because athletes have been doing very, very well on a higher carbohydrate diet for a long period of time. And all the ketogenic diets that I've seen have seemed to, at best, come close to matching performance, but most commonly just underperforming a carbohydrate diet. So, like I said, I'm not holding my breath for it.
no, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because I didn't even realize that there was a body of research. So, I guess like early depletion followed by rapid repletion, and I also don't know. I mean, so we're saying for running performance, and I'm assuming this is long distance running
Um,
as opposed to.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think it might have been like maybe for soccer and or marathon runners and things like. I think it's more in that realm, like more for
Yeah.
aerobic athletes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Is that that's so when the conversation about the sport performance implications for ketosis or ketogenic diets really took off, however many years that I lose track of diet fad popularity because there's so
Yeah.
there's so many. I'm just numb to it now. Uh, but sorry, I digress. I do remember them highlighting that there are possibly some there if there are benefits, they are mostly exclusive to your long distance, like endurance type athletes, as opposed to your higher intensity strength style athletes, which physiologically does make sense. But again, I can't tell sometimes if with these new, like these new literature reviews, if someone's just trying to reinvent the wheel for the sake of
Yeah. Well,
change.
even the endurance stuff has kind of been called into question.
Yeah,
There's actually new research, not new, I guess it's been out for a couple of years now, but relatively new, I guess, that has called some of that into question as well. Because at first it was like touted as, oh, it's better for endurance. And then it was like, oh, it might be better for strength as well. And then like, oh, it turns out it's definitely not better for strength. And then it's like, oh, it turns out it's definitely not better for endurance either. Because
yeah,
actually, Alan Aragon did a great review when he did a presentation. He talked about race winning strategies because there's different legs of a race, right? And so in that final stretch, this is kind of one component of his presentation to kind of paraphrase some of it. But in the final stretch, you actually aren't running anymore. Like you're like doing a full on sprint, right? So you actually need enough glycogen and carbohydrates in your system to allow you to have those final bursts of energy to finish the race, right?
yeah,
And to be at a certain pace at different stages of the race as well. And so they found that yeah, like the ketogenic type diets just don't really perform as well as people want them to.
yeah. No, that's and I won't take us further off course, but I guess a final point there regarding new literature, and this is something I'm sure you've talked about, especially like either on your podcast or with Mike or other colleagues in person, and that's for viewers. This is really for viewers, especially if you're new to literature and I guess like scientific training, and that's when you see a new claim, that's hailing some like marvelous marvelous result, with this new quick trick. I found it's often smart to maybe keep it off to the side, and be like, okay, like we'll keep this as like a yellow blinking light, but I'm going to keep going with what we know is tried and true for sure, especially if it's working. Right? There's definitely no point in reinventing the wheel, and we will watch and see if that yellow blinking light gravitates toward a green light, or even if components of it kind of sprinkle down into our, to our green light, we get the thumbs up. Okay, this is absolutely good. This is definitely beneficial, and it lines up with what we know about, the physiology of adaptation for sport performance. Or if like many new claims, it ends up just being a flat out red light. It just bonks. And that's kind of what you just highlighted a second ago. Is you have a new claim. It takes off for a little bit, and then they circle back around and determine that it's absolutely not beneficial in the way they originally thought, and that that researchers and practitioners kind of had it right from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, so circling back to common mistakes going in, right? So we were just talking about starting a water weight cut protocol too early, but then starting it too late also, right? So there, I have this is especially prevalent in the fight community, where we have even at the professional level, I have people DM me or come up to me in person and be like, hey man, I fight this weekend, I gotta drop, I gotta drop 10 or 20 pounds. What can I do to get to shed this weight off? And I'm like, oh, it's Friday. Like, like ask me
Yeah.
ask me at least 6 days ago, but in all honesty, give me 8 weeks to actually work with you. I have no idea what your training is look like. I have no idea how you've been eating, and at that point, like, I've just been kind of eating like junk, or they say, I've been eating clean, which really, in my experience means they have like Monday really clean,
Yeah.
Tuesday they cave and eat cake, and Wednesday they eat clean again.
Yeah, it's so
So,
funny because like, so I actually used to box and compete in boxing and Muay Thai, but I first started in grappling and jiu-jitsu, and you'd always get people being like, like, what do I do if he has me in a rear naked choke? And it's like, don't get there. Like, get there. Like, if he's got you in a choke and you're like, how do I get his, how do I get stop being strangled? It's like, dude, it's too late. Like, yes, there are
yeah,
defenses, but you've missed about 80 steps for him to get on your back and be choking you to death, basically. Like,
for sure.
it's too late. Like just bad questions, bad strategy, bad responsibility, bad athlete management. It's just like, come on, man. Like one or
Yeah.
2 days, you want me to help you cut 20 pounds? Like, what are you doing?
Like, no, it's not exactly. It's like, you ain't
Yeah,
about to put me at like, hey, not only is it frustrating from an athlete responsibility and respect standpoint, but it's dangerous too. I'm like,
super
you don't understand
dangerous.
the
Yeah,
severity, of risk you're asking me to impose upon you, and it's just not for me as a coach. It's not a responsible decision to even take that on. I'm just like, hey, in all honesty, see if you can get a catch weight, or I know it'll suck, but maybe you're gonna have to pull out, and hopefully that's a lesson learned, for athletes like that, where it's like, okay, you need to shift gears, and instead of asking for help while you're in the choke, which obviously there are things you can do, just like there are things you can do if you botch a weight cut later, deep into the process, but ideally you have all of your sets, you have all your ducks in a row prior to going. Um, But I think those are the two biggest ones
yeah.
off the top of my head, though. It's like starting too early or just starting flat out too late.
And so generally, like you would recommend, I think, anyways, correct me if I'm wrong. Generally, you recommend starting like almost a week out or something like that. That's when you kind of start your water
Like
loading.
roughly, like 5 or 6 days. Yeah,
Five.
five
Yeah.
or six
Okay.
days.
Yeah.
You have at least 3 days of solid loading, and then that gives you that gives you a good 12 to 36 hour window to make changes, because there is the individual difference component there as well. Where you have, like I said, you have different lifestyles and different responses to stress. Well, you have like different tolerances and different thresholds and tolerances to stress across athletes. And then different training strategies. Like we're talking right now, we're talking about the difference between an MMA athlete and a power lifter, but even within the powerlifting or specifically the MMA, the MMA situation, there are going to be differences across there too. So, that is where I would say the art portion comes in as well. But definitely having 3 solid days of loading going into it is what I recommend.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is really important as well is, like you said, at some point you might just need to kind of throw in the towel because, like with powerlifting, it's not like MMA. In MMA, you go in there and you're unprepared. If you're unfit, if your water cut fucks you up, like you're going to be getting kicked and kneed in the face. Like that's serious. There's serious consequences for being unprepared. In powerlifting, it's like, you don't do as well as you thought you would. Okay. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like, big deal. There's not really any consequences outside of like a bruised ego. And so, like, a lot of the times I'll just tell people, like, for the first couple of meets, like, don't worry about your fucking weight, you know?
Hmm.
Just go in there, have fun, see if you even like it, and enjoy it, and that's it, but don't worry about something like, unless you're set to win like nationals or worlds or break a record, like it's not that big of a deal, you know
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so unless something like that is on the line, in my opinion, it's just like, who gives a shit,
Yeah.
because there's just not the same level of consequences there is in like MMA or boxing or something like that. So I mean, yeah, that's also something to kind of keep in mind too. um, I was kind of curious about this. Do you use any sort of like tech to monitor someone's status and whether or not they're kind of entering potentially like a dangerous zone? Like if they are at risk of like, hypernatremia or something like that.
No tech at this point, man. That's so this is where I'm crossing my fingers that when an athlete inquires about weight cut coaching, that they're working with a physician, because I like to collaborate with that physician. And if they're getting, whether they're getting blood work done or not, or even if we can at least have like a checklist of common symptoms associated with extreme dehydration, especially if you're doing a 24-hour weight cut where you're like beyond 7 to 10% of your body weight, and dehydration is, where the dangerous things start to happen. Or early on with the water loading process, you have those hyponatremia risk as well. If we can check off some of this list, like, okay, do you have headaches, headaches right now, or dizziness, memory, or coordination issues or things like that. We can troubleshoot for solutions before things go awry, and so that is where the communication and auto-regulation component really comes into play. Like, as opposed to a normal client where I'm checking, you check in 3 times weekly, let's say, just to ask, okay, how's weight going? How's life going? This is very serious, where you're on the athlete, and ideally, especially if you're doing it remotely, you're making them feel like you are with them every step of the way, and that you are part of their team, so that you can collaborate with health specialists on the spot.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important as well, because like you said, there's just so many variables that can impact the effectiveness of the strategy. It could be a perfect strategy, but then something happens and they just, like travel, for instance, right? Like I definitely know that if I'm flying, I get super dehydrated. I don't know what it is, if it's the elevation, maybe it's just purely psychological, but I get headaches, I get dehydrated, I don't feel like eating anything. I get kind of like queasy, even just at the thought of eating anything. But then at the same time, like I have to eat or else I feel worse. So it's like it's kind of really weird. And so like there's all sorts of things that can kind of like fuck you up. And if you don't necessarily have that in place, or that communication, there's no possibility to like pivot. There's, and even, yeah, like you mentioned about the headaches and stuff like that. If you don't know about these things, if you don't know what to look for, and all of a sudden this stuff starts happening, you can kind of catastrophize and be like, oh my God, maybe I'm getting sick. Maybe I'm overtrained. Maybe something bad is happening. You're like, whoa, 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 no, we already talked about this. You're good. This was expected. All that means we need to make this change, and then you're good to go. So it can kind of help manage a lot of those variables, including the stress response or whatever, might come from it. So no, I think that's great. So, we, for the most part, we kind of covered everything that I wanted to touch on. Was there anything else that maybe we didn't discuss that you think is pertinent to share with some of the listeners?
Um, I think I think you got about as much out of me regarding water weight cutting that you're going to get for now, at least. Something, and I'm quoting Derek again on this one, Derek Wilcox. When you're approaching a water weight cut, this is for the listeners really. There's a term in martial arts called kazushi, where you off balance each other, right? So it's big in judo, but with grappling, and it's even kind of present in striking. It's this idea that you push and pull, right, to get a response out of your opponent, right? You push a little bit, and then you observe and say, okay, is my opponent pushing back, or are they pulling away, and vice versa. And that's in essence how the water weight cut process will work. And in all honesty, since we're principles focused coaches, I guess I'm speaking back to you, Daniel. This is a principle that's present in all of training and dieting, period. Right? You push in one direction, whether that's with a training stimulus, or with a caloric load, or in this case, a water load, and then you pull, and then based on your knowledge of the physiology of the body, you observe and see how it responds and what are your next best steps, so that you can so that the timing component is hit perfectly to ensure, again, safety, but then the best peak and water cut, so that you can reconstitute and show up for competition ready to go. And so if you approach all things with that Kazushi principle, you're in control of the process, right? The more educated you are on how the body works, and I would even say the mind regarding stress, like we touched on earlier, the more you can command the direction in which your body goes and then manipulate things accordingly.
No, 100%. I think that's a great point to kind of like end things on here as well. So where can people find you?
So right now, the best spot is going to be Wil Starks MMA on Instagram.
Awesome. It was a great chat, man. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me.